Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dark Alpha's Caress by Donna Grant, narrated by Victoria Mcgloven. Chapter 1. Ballycastle, Ireland, July. She had officially lost her mind. That was the only thing she could think of that would have taken her from her home on the Isle of Skye and brought her to Northern Ireland. Sorcha wasn't exactly courageous. In fact, she considered herself a hermit. But because she preferred to be alone, it made it easier for her to do precisely what she was currently doing. "Rona, you owe me big for this," she mumbled to herself as she walked the hilly landscape toward the coast. The wind whipped her hair from its braid and into her eyes. She pulled the strands out of her lashes and tucked them behind her ears, but it did no good as the next gust tugged them free and put them right back. Sorcha's heart pounded more erratically with every step she took. She was the last person who should be here. She was a horrible liar. Not only that, but she also caved under pressure. Always. There was a reason she liked her solitude. She didn't have to answer to anyone, and no one looked to her for anything, which meant she couldn't let anyone down. But this was bigger than her. It was bigger than the Sky Druids. That's why she was here. No longer could she turn a blind eye to what was going on. What Usail had done to Coran, the leader of the Sky Druids, was enough to convince Sorcha to get off her arse. It had been no surprise when Sorcha learned that Rona had taken over as leader of the Druids. As soon as she heard the news, she went to Rona and offered to do anything to help. It had never entered her mind that Rona might send her off on a dangerous mission that could very well get her killed. Sorcha stopped walking. Her thighs burned from the incline. The sky had grown darker from an incoming storm. She turned and looked back the way she'd come. There hadn't been anyone around, and that's how this had been planned. The only way this would work was if she remained unseen. Even so, she and Rona had come up with a story in case she was stopped. She drew in a deep breath and zipped up her raincoat. Every fibre of her being wanted to return to Skye and the safety of her cottage. For so long, she had buried her head in the sand and let others handle things, all because she was too scared to actually live. Bracing herself for whatever was to come, Sorcha began walking again. The climb up to the summit was for skilled climbers only. Spray from the sea coated everything in a fine mist, making the rocks and the grass slippery. She had to watch every step she took, and she wasn't even to the most dangerous part yet. Climbing such cliffs and mountains had been something Sorcha had grown up doing with her mother and sister. She was an expert, but that didn't mean she liked what was happening. She didn't know these cliffs like she did the ones on Skye. A crack of lightning, followed closely by a boom of thunder, made her jump. Loose sediment slipped beneath her feet and caused her to slide. She quickly grabbed hold of an outcropping of rock and a clump of grass to stop herself. "Bloody hell," she murmured, and paused long enough to gather herself. Then she continued. She didn't look back again. Little by little, she progressed over the terrain. She covered a lot of ground before the first raindrop landed on her. Sorcha ignored it as the path became narrower. She glanced up and saw a group of people ahead. The moment she saw them, she ducked down, afraid that they might have seen her as well. When no shout of warning or the sound of anyone coming for her followed, Sorcha slowly rose up enough to see ahead. Only then did she continue on. The fat raindrops came down more readily. She lifted up the hood of her raincoat as she inched closer, using the footholds and handholds to keep herself anchored to the cliff. Then, finally, she was there. Sorcha pressed her forehead to the damp rocks of the cliff and let out a relieved breath. She'd worry about getting back once she was finished here. She strained her ears to listen, but she couldn't make out any of the words being said by the group. She had come this far. There was no way she would leave without something. She reached up and grabbed a rock before she set her foot on another and climbed. It was only a meter's difference, but it allowed her to hear. The only problem was that she needed to hang off the side of the cliff to do it. "You have to see," a woman said, her Irish accent thick. "Now is our time. We can no longer stand back and wait for someone to come to us. It's time we act." A man snorted loudly. "We might be druids, but we do not stand a chance against the Fae. I've heard they're gathering their own group." "Feck the Fae," the woman stated angrily. "This isn't their world, it's ours." A cheer went up from the others. "You say that until a Fae shows up," the man retorted. "I doubt you'd be so quick to say those words if they did." Sorcha raised up enough to try and see who had spoken. The crowd stood in a circle. A glow emanated from the ground in the center of the group, the light showing everyone's face, including the man and woman in the middle. The woman was in her mid-40s with chin-length straight black hair laced with grey. She was attractive, with a trim figure she showed off with tight-fitting clothes. The man appeared in his 40s as well. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a beer belly that looked as if he'd sported it for many years. His blonde hair had thinned on the top, and the comb-over he seemed to prefer blew in the wind. Sorcha knew that the Fae sometimes liked to use glamour to disguise their beauty so they could walk among mortals. There was always a chance there could be Fae around, but she didn't think the two main speakers were it. The fact that she was hiding proved just how secretive this meeting was, and how secure the area had been. None of them seemed concerned with the cliffs, because only someone highly skilled, or an idiot, would even dare what she was doing. Sorcha was pretty sure she was also an idiot, but there was no turning back now. She was here, and she would finish her mission so she could return with intel for the druids. Then, she would go back to her cottage and return to the hermit lifestyle she'd lived for the past decade. The woman in the middle of the circle shook her head. "Patrick, isn't it time we stood up to the Fae? Isn't it time we showed everyone who we are?" "We?" Patrick asked with a bark of laughter. "You can combine all of our magic together, and it still wouldn't be enough against one Fae. How the bloody hell do you think we can fight against them?" "Who said anything about fighting them?" she asked with a pointed look. Patrick ran a hand down his face and walked away a few steps before turning back to her. "You've lost your mind. You're basing all of this on hearsay." "Hearsay from someone who is a Fae," she pointed out. "Beth, that Fae could have been planted at the pub so you'd overhear him and do all of this." "You heard him too." Patrick sighed as he dropped his chin to his chest and put his hands on his hips. After a few tense moments where the only sound was the rain pelting the ground, he lifted his head. "The others were disbanded. Whatever their main goal was, we'll never know. But what we do know is that they're gone." "There's no way they're gone," Beth said. There were nods of agreement from the other druids around the circle, some adding eyes as well. Sorcha's arms started to ache. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stay in this position. "It was probably all a lie," Patrick said. A woman with dark skin stepped forward. "It isn't a lie. I can say that because I was part of the others. Moran chose me herself." Everyone looked at the woman, including Sorcha. She memorized the woman's features, all while hoping to hear a name. Beth gave Patrick an "I told you so" expression. "Between her words and what we overheard, I decided to call this rally together with those I knew were not only powerful enough to stand against the Fae, but also strong enough mentally to know what they're getting into. Patrick ignored Beth and looked at the other woman. Where is Moran? I don't know. I've not heard from her in weeks. Patrick threw up his hands and glared at Beth. See? But, the woman said, drawing out the word to get everyone's attention. I can tell you that I was visited by the Dragon Kings, who made it very clear that I was to forget anything to do with the others. At the mention of the Dragon Kings, some druids stepped back, visibly shaken, while others frowned in concern. Sorcha knew of the kings, but she had never met one. She honestly wasn't sure she wanted to. She knew they protected this realm and had since the beginning of time, but they were obviously a group that one simply didn't want to fuck with on any level. Beth jerked her head to the woman. Dragon Kings? You never said anything about them. Why does it matter? The woman asked, with a twist of her lips. It matters because of who they are, Patrick told her. You should take their warning to heart. The woman laughed. The others were out to destroy the kings, and it was working too. Patrick rolled his eyes. Obviously not, if the others are gone and the kings are still here. And why would the others want to be rid of the kings? None of that matters, Beth shouted, and slashed her arm through the air to halt any more talk. We're here because the others needed druids. That's what we are. If the Fae think they can form a group themselves to take over what the others began, then there's no reason we can't do the same. This time, it was Sorcha who rolled her eyes. She debated showing herself to the group to tell them the facts of what had happened between the others, the Dragon Kings, the Fae, and the Druids. Still, she realized none of them would believe her. They wanted their own version of the facts, and that was the only thing they would listen to. It would be her folly if she allowed them to know that she was here. No longer able to hold herself up, she let her arms straighten so she could lower herself down. It didn't take long for her to realize that the words of the group were garbled once more. Sorcha steeled herself and resumed the position to pull herself up. We need to take a vote, Patrick said. Beth nodded and folded her arms over her chest. I agree. All for creating a druid group, raise your hand. Sorcha's gaze scanned the circle to see that more than half had raised their hands. Against? Patrick asked as he raised his. Fewer people were completely against the idea, but even more in the circle hadn't chosen a side at all. Beth flashed a bright smile. Guess we know who wins. Not so quick, Patrick pointed out. Many didn't vote. Beth wasn't happy to hear that. She must have realized that if she pushed things now, those who didn't vote might not side with her, which meant that Patrick would have won. Instead, the druid said, All right. Let's take a few days to think about it. Let's meet back here again in 3 days. Everyone who comes must vote. Understood? The group nodded and began to turn and hurry away as lightning lit up the sky. With that cue, the rain intensified. Sorcha wanted to stay and listen, see if anything else was exchanged. But between her arms aching and the roar of the rain, she doubted she'd be able to hear anything. Deciding to be safe, she carefully lowered herself and looked over her shoulder at the storm that raged behind her. She then looked at the cliffside and the narrow trail she'd used. The growing darkness, along with the storm, made it difficult to see. She didn't want to get caught out on the cliffs. It was either go up and climb over the edge with the possibility of someone in the group seeing her, or she could go back the way she'd come. Sorcha debated the choices for a moment, and decided to chance going back along the cliffs. This wouldn't be the first time she'd gotten caught in a rainstorm while climbing, but it was the first time in Ireland, on cliffs she didn't know, and she was alone, without anchors. "Well, this night just keeps getting better and better," she said. She took a step and was suddenly slammed against the cliffs by a fierce wind gust. Her hands clenched the rock in an effort to stay rooted to the spot. Maybe she should have chanced climbing up and over. Then she thought about being caught climbing up with wind like that, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Slow and steady," she told herself. The same words her mother had used often with her and her sister. The rain pelted her now. The droplets were large and heavy as they slammed against her. The lightning, wind, and thunder sounded and felt as if it were on top of her, but she didn't look up to find out. She didn't take her eyes from her route, because all it would take was one slip for her to fall. No one would hear her screams over the storm, and her body would likely not be found for days. She had no identification on her, so the authorities wouldn't even be able to return her to Scotland. The last thing she wanted to do was die in Ireland. She still couldn't believe she was on the isle the Fae called home. She'd hated it for as long as she could remember, and the current situation didn't make her feel all warm and fuzzy. An eternity later, with a couple of heart-stopping slips, she finally made it back to solid ground. Even then, she had to traverse the rocky terrain down to where she'd parked the rental car. Sorcha picked up the pace. Now that she was off the cliffside, she felt she could move more quickly. It was a mistake. Within minutes, her foot slipped off a wet rock and she twisted her ankle. She crumpled, grabbing her injury. "Damn it," she said, as her ankle began to throb. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted lightning not far from her. It hit the ground, causing a loud crack. Sorcha screamed and jumped. She had to get to the car and out of the storm. She wasn't safe here. But when she tried to put weight on her injured foot, her eyes welled up with tears. She fell back onto her butt and slapped her hand on the ground beside her. How could this be happening? She knew better than to rush through terrain she didn't know, but to do it at twilight during a storm. It was a rookie mistake that she shouldn't have made. Lightning flashed again, revealing the outline of a man about 20 meters below her. He stood as still as a statue as he faced her. She jumped for a second time, unsure what to do. Was it one of the men from the rally? Someone else? The man moved slowly toward her before he stopped again. Another flash of lightning revealed his very tall silhouette and incredibly broad shoulders and thick arms, showcased by his wet t-shirt that was now molded to his body. She couldn't see much of his face other than a strong jawline and penetrating eyes. "You seem to be in need of assistance," he said. She heard the Irish accent in his deep voice. He purposefully kept his distance so as not to scare her. The next flash of lightning had him looking up at the storm above them. "I think we'd best get out of this weather, don't you?" he asked as he offered her his hand. There was no way she could get down to her car without help. She had no choice but to trust him. "Yes," she said, and took his proffered palm. He easily lifted her into his arms, cradling her against him. Sorcha felt the movement of his muscles beneath her hands as she wrapped them around his neck. There was no denying the hard stomach against her, or the softness of the long hair he had gathered at the back of his neck. There was something about a man with long hair that just did it for her. Few could really pull it off, but she gave credit to those who tried. Within moments they were at the bottom of the mountain, not far from where she'd hidden her car. She glanced back at the rugged terrain, trying to figure out how he'd come down it so quickly. Had she been so wrapped up in all the hard sinew against her that she hadn't paid attention? There was no other explanation.
"Where shall I take you?"
Her head snapped toward his. That's when she realized that she was very near his face. Unfortunately, she still couldn't get a good look at him. "Oh, my car is parked over there," she said, pointing in the general direction. He said nothing else as he strode to her vehicle. Once there, he gently set her down until she leaned against the car with her injured foot lifted. "Thank you," she said. He gave a nod.
"You should be careful. These are dangerous times, and there are many more dangers out there."
She couldn't tell if he was threatening her or warning her. Not that it mattered. She was well aware of what was out there. Sorcha pulled the key fob from her pants pocket and unlocked the vehicle. "You're very right." She opened the car door. "Thank you, But when she glanced up, he was gone. Sorcha didn't look for him. Instead, she got into the car and locked the doors before starting the engine. Chapter 2. Cathal hadn't moved from his spot near the Halfling, but he was veiled, which meant that no one but another Reaper, or Death herself, could see him. The last thing he'd expected to see that night was a Halfling on the cliffs, listening to a bunch of druids talk about creating an offshoot group of others. After everything the Dragon Kings had gone through to end the others, it boggled his mind that druids and fae now wanted to create their own groups. The only difference was the druids didn't stand a chance. Cathal watched as the car carrying the Halfling drove away. There had been no mistaking her Scottish accent. That only added to his confusion as to why she had been out here tonight, and not just for a walk. She had scaled the side of the cliff to listen to the druids. He'd kept one eye on the assembled group, and another on her in case she fell. But the Halfling had been more than competent, even in the storm. Everything would have been fine had she been more careful on her way down the mountain. She had been in too much of a hurry, though, and it had caused her to hurt an ankle. Before he knew it, he'd lowered his veil and spoken with her. He still wasn't sure what had come over him. Maybe it was because there had been no one else to help her, and she'd definitely needed assistance. No matter how curious he was to know her intentions, he hadn't asked. She wouldn't have told him anything anyway. The air shifted slightly, and Rawdon appeared beside him. He was smiling, which made Cathal roll his eyes.
"You didn't think I'd see you helping the Halfling, did you?"
Rawdon asked cheerfully. Cathal shot him a flat look.
"Wipe that smile off your face before I do it for you."
In the next instant, Aisling joined them. "Listen to him, Rawdon," she advised.
"You two are no fun,"
Rawdon replied with a frown. Aisling cut her eyes to Cathal and simply stared. She had red eyes, just as he did, marking them both as dark fae. Or at least, they had been dark at one time. Being a Reaper meant that whatever happened before you died no longer mattered once you were reborn to serve death. "Why did you help her? She's a Halfling. She would have been just fine on her own," Aisling said. Cathal felt the gaze of both Reapers on him. He shrugged.
"I don't know."
"It's not like you're going to see her again, so it doesn't matter." Rawdon smiled as he crossed his arms over his chest.
"He helped the Halfling because he likes her."
It took a great deal of effort not to punch Rawdon, but Cathal managed to keep his hands to himself. Rawdon's comments were rarely directed at him. Clearly he wasn't so lucky this night.
What?
Rawdon said with a chuckle, as Aisling speared him with a flat look.
When have you ever seen Cathal help a halfling? Like I'm just supposed to let that go without comment?
He rolled his silver eyes.
Please.
Aisling shook her head of long black and silver braids but didn't reply. Cathal watched until the car's tail lights were out of view. The halfling had been wary of him, which was smart. The fact that she'd been there secretly intrigued him. He'd wanted to ask her what she was about, but she would have likely made up some lie, and he couldn't stand to hear that, no matter the reason. Regardless of how he looked at it, he couldn't figure out why a halfling was there, unless she was spying on someone in the group. That made him pause. She didn't appear as if she were following a specific person. In fact, she'd seemed intrigued by everyone and everything. That brought him back to why she had been on the mountain to begin with. A Scotswoman, at that. Rawdon said,
Looks like we have a lot to report. Shall we head back? You two go ahead,
Cathal said.
I've got something to do first.
The moment the words were out of his mouth, Cathal knew Rawdon would comment on them. He pointed a finger at his friend and shook his head.
Not a word. Not one single bloody word.
Rawdon slapped his hands against his thighs.
You're no fun. No fun at all.
I know that look, Aisling told Cathal. You're going to follow the halfling. Why? He shrugged.
Something doesn't add up with her being here.
What does it matter what a halfling does? Aisling said dismissively.
Unless the Fae others recruited her and sent her,
Rawdon stated. Cathal hadn't thought of that. He ran a hand down his face, wiping away the rain. None of them cared about the storm.
She was nervous.
I would be as well out in a storm like this on a cliff. Aisling shrugged. Then again, I wouldn't have been that stupid to get into such a predicament. Rawdon twisted his lips.
Unless she had no choice.
Damn. The more they spoke, the more Cathal had to know what was going on with the halfling. He wanted to let it go. He wished he could, but he couldn't. Something about her affected him. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't appear to know she was a halfling. It could be because she had been soaked, scared, and entirely at the mercy of the elements. Perhaps it was because she'd put on a brave face, even though he'd seen her vulnerability despite it. Aisling sighed loudly. Fine. Let's go after her.
What?
Cathal asked in surprise as he looked at both of them.
No, there's no need. I'll go alone.
Rawdon slapped him on the back.
Sorry, big guy. Death sent us here together. We're going to return together. If that means we take a little detour, then we go as a team.
He's right, Aisling said, before Cathal could speak. Cathal knew better than to argue with them. Neither would relent. It was better to just agree and allow them to accompany him. The quicker he figured out what the halfling was doing, the sooner they could return to Death and relay what the druids were planning. As if the Reapers didn't have enough shite to deal with. First, the Fae forming their own group, and now the druids. What was wrong with everyone? The Dragon Kings had annihilated the others, and the others were the only ones who had a fighting chance of actually killing the kings. There was no way any random group of Fae or druids would even come close to doing harm to the Dragon Kings. Unless they weren't after the kings.
If that frown gets any deeper, we can call it the Grand Canyon,
Rawdon said. Cathal glanced at him to find the Reaper's silver eyes on him. He blinked.
What?
You're frowning, Aisling told him.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?